figures that give us a sense of the very real dictatorial exceptionalism, the lack of political development in the Middle East compared to other regions of the world, is this figure that shows you levels of political freedom as mentioned by the as measured by the Freedom House score in these countries. And here, the lower the figure, the better. Freedom House, if you're Norway or Denmark, you're 1-1, right? So low is good. And then if you're Saudi Arabia or Uzbekistan or North Korea, you're 7-7. That's bad, okay? So here we're actually looking to see how low the column is. Again, the Anglo-Saxon world, 1974, and you have a timeline here. The red, 1974, 2002, and then 2006. You see dramatic drops, i.e. dramatic improvements, in the level of political freedom across many parts of the world. Some places more spectacular than others. I mentioned Eastern Europe and Asia, a real drop, a real improvement in levels of civil and political rights. The only region in the world where levels of freedom today are not only not better than they were in 1974, but in some respects, certainly in 2002, worse than they were in 1974, is the Middle East. So the Middle East is bucking a global trend where the entire world is becoming more democratic, some areas more successfully so, some less. The Middle East is moving in the wrong direction. The Middle East is moving towards greater autocracy since the mid-1970s. This is another way of showing this. You can see the improvement that was achieved globally from 1974 to 2006. Countries of the Arab League, on average, rank as not free. Non-Arab Muslim states rank as not free. And you can see the scores from 1974 till 2006, they hardly improve. In fact, in 2002, the scores are worse than they were in 1974. Okay, so a democratic deficit, the Middle Eastern exceptionalism, some would say, we can argue about whether this is Muslim exceptionalism or Arab exceptionalism, it's not the same thing. It exists. And it exists in a very, very tangible way. But is there a link between tyranny and terror? Some would argue that there isn't. If you want, you can. I cite the literature. Anybody who wants more specific references, come up to me at the end. I'll be happy to provide them for you. The main criticism I have of this literature that claims that there is no relationship between tyranny and terrorism is that these studies tend to look at where international terrorism strikes rather than where terrorists come from, right? So if you look at the various indices, the data that we have about where international terrorism strikes, where does it actually take place physically, right? Liberal democracies are also, as we know, subject and they're targeted by international terrorism. And the studies that claim that there is no statistical relationship between the political regime type of a country and where international terrorism strikes may make sense. In fact, Piazza makes this, to my mind, rather ludicrous argument, which is if democracy were to spread around the world, we will see an increase of terrorism because terrorists like to strike liberal democracies. Okay? Well, I shouldn't call it ludicrous. It's an argument, but it's one that I think shows the problem of measuring the impact of international terrorism by looking at where international terrorism strikes rather than where terrorists come from. And when we look at where terrorists come from, the picture, of course, is very, very different. Okay? Let me just cite a few figures. 2008 study by the West Point's Combating Terrorism Center found that, and I quote, low levels of civil liberties are a powerful predictor of the national origin of foreign fighters in Iraq. Out of 600 captured al-Qaeda fighters in Iraq, 41% were from Saudi Arabia, 19% were from Libya. A Freedom House study that looked at incidences of terrorism from 1999 till 2003 found that 70% of all deaths from terrorism were caused by terrorists and terrorist groups originating in not free societies, i.e. dictatorial societies, while only 8% of all fatalities were generated by terrorists with origins in free societies. And so on and so forth. We have several studies by Kruger and others, Kruger and also David Layton from Stanford, that found that countries that afford a low level of political rights are more likely to be springboards for terrorism. Okay, this is the range. This is the debate that's in the literature with my analysis of the problematic idea that one should measure the impact of international terrorism by where international terrorism strikes, rather than where terrorists originate from. We can hopefully speak about that a little bit. Turning to my third and second to last point. Contrary to popular opinion, and what you might gather from the international media over the last several years, George W. Bush did not invent democracy promotion. And so the Saudi king should not be surprised about American demands to democratize in this cartoon. In fact, democracy promotion is one of the oldest and most enduring themes of American foreign policy, essentially from the late 19th century. We can go back to William McKinley's taking of the Philippines and Puerto Rico in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. This was explained on the basis of the need to bring democracy to the Philippines and Puerto Rico. Of course, Woodrow Wilson's famous 14 points and the call to make the world safe for democracy. We can look at FDR and Harry Truman's post-Second World War campaign to democratize Japan and Germany, which I think in some respects still resonates very powerfully for Americans as an example, maybe not as powerfully as it did before the Iraq and Afghanistan campaign, but the ability of the United States to transform aggressive foes into allies through nation building, state building, and imposed democratization. Dwight Eisenhower's pledge to free the captive nations of Eastern Europe. I'm running forward here. Bill Clinton's democratic enlargement doctrine, right, in the aftermath of the Cold War, and of course George W. Bush's freedom agenda. The other point to remember here is that democracy promotion is not a partisan issue in the United States. We have had American presidents, Republicans and Democrats, who were extremely passionate about promoting democracy. And we have had American presidents, both Democrats and Republicans, who have been far more reluctant to engage in this. This is not a partisan issue for the United States. Another critical point that I think we should bear in mind when we come to speak about the idea of promoting democracy as a if not a panacea, then at least a partial cure for the scourge of international terrorism, is the idea that Americans have seen democracy promotion as a prescribed solution to a number of thorny foreign policy headaches throughout their history. Okay? So if we go back to the end of the Second World War, FDR and Harry Truman saw the promotion of democracy, and before them, of course, Woodrow Wilson, saw the promotion of democracy as a central pillar of the construction of a liberal international order, right? Which was also based on international law and on the foundation of the UN and the other Bretton Woods institutions, the creation of NATO, the encouragement of European integration, and so on and so forth. I have already mentioned this, the reformation of dangerous enemies in the aftermath of their crushing defeat, Japan and Germany, was also, there too, democracy promotion was seen as a critical solution to a very difficult problem. In the 1970s, dealing with large-scale human rights abuses in America's backyard was seen as something that could be resolved through the promotion of democracy. Ronald Reagan saw the establishment of the CSCE, what later became the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, as a critical tool with which to undermine the ideology of the Soviet Union through the spreads of human rights and democracy. Anchoring the fragile economies and emerging democracies of Central and Eastern Europe in NATO and the EU, there too, democracy promotion was a critical component of American policy in the 1990s. Economic development in Africa. If you were to look at documents of USAID or the World Bank or the UN in the 80s and 1990s, you would see no reference to democracy. Today, if you would open up the documents of the World Bank, the IMF, the UN, you will see that promoting good governance, the rule of law, anti-corruption, human rights, democracy is a critical component of perceived the right way to go in terms of promoting economic development in underdeveloped countries, especially in Africa. And now we come to the curbing of international terrorism. The promotion of democracy as a solution. We see that the United States has a history of turning to democracy promotion as a way of seeking to resolve complex, thorny foreign policy problems. Why do Americans do it? Very briefly, they do it because they feel very strongly that it is in their national interest, right? The democratic peace theory, right? Every enemy of the United States has either been an autocracy or political movement with anti-democratic sentiments. Markets, political freedom and economic freedoms tend to go together. And if you promote democracy around the world, you also promote American investment and American trade. It's good for the American economy. John Eikenberry has called the liberal international order American imperialism, in the sense that spreading capitalist democracy around the world is viewed by American foreign policy elites, or many of them, as a way of ensuring continued American leadership around the world. And that has certainly been a very successful strategy since the end of the Second World War. But I also would not underestimate the issue of values, not just the issue of national interest, but the issue of values. The notion of American exceptionalism, the notion that America has a universal promise to be a city upon the hill, that American values are universal values, and that therefore what is right for the people of the United States is also right for the people of the world, that people everywhere crave freedom. This is something that resonates, I think, very powerfully in the American political culture. It's also something that has helped legitimize and empower presidents over the year. The appeal to democratic values, the appeal to democratic rhetoric is something that plays well in terms of domestic politics. It's something that helps to elevate the presidency and to put America on its best side to the world. Okay, do Americans take democracy promotion seriously? I would say this. I would say that democracy promotion has never, ever been the overarching American foreign policy agenda. It has always been one of several guiding principles, including under George W. Bush, right? I would also say that democracy promotion is emphasized in American foreign policy when it is perceived to be compatible with U.S. security and economic interests. For example, as Central and Eastern Europe was beginning to democratize in the early 1990s, we see a flood of American democracy promotion activities supporting these countries, trying to make sure that they become consolidated democracies, that they become good markets for the United States. This is what Thomas Carothers has called democracy promotion following democratization, not the other way around. Okay? I would also argue that when democracy promotion is viewed as being contrary to key security and economic interests of the United States, democracy promotion is usually overridden. It's usually put aside. And we can point to the fact that both the Soviet Union and the United States supported the Ceausescu regime in Romania, for example, until its very last days. We can also more contemporaneously look at the American policy towards Bahrain, towards Jordan, towards Saudi Arabia today. When there are key security and economic interests at stake, democracy promotion takes a back seat. I would also argue that the American democracy promotion is hampered by serious intellectual and institutional shortcoming. The first major shortcoming is that, and I've seen this time and time again in Washington, as I've seen this also in the European Union, at the UN, the World Bank, US policymakers have no theory of democratization. They don't really know how it happens. What do I mean by that? There are two major theories of democratization. One is what we might call the modernization theory, right? How do you promote democracy? You encourage urbanization, you encourage literacy, you encourage education. Those create a middle class. The middle class then demands political freedom as it demands economic freedom, as it acquires economic power. And then you have a transition to democracy. Okay? Now, if you believe the modernization theory of democratization, how should the United States spend its money? It should spend its money on building infrastructure, because infrastructure promotes markets, encourages people to move to the city. It should spend its money on literacy program, especially for women. It should spend its money on encouraging the regulatory and financial modernization of a country so that foreign direct investment flows in, right? But there's an alternative theory that says that modernization has nothing to do with it. If modernization was an absolute prerequisite of democratization, then perhaps India would not have been the democracy that it is. Perhaps Mongolia would not have been the democracy that it is. There is a competing theory of democratization that says that it's really all about political choice. It's really all about people deciding to put in place the institutions of political freedom. And if you believe that, and I think that when we, for example, look at the Bush administration's fate, that elections in the Palestinian Authority, which brought to power Hamas in 2006, or that elections in Iraq would make Iraq a beacon of democracy, there was a stronger sense that it was really a question of political choice. That if dirt poor countries like Namibia could become democracies, then the Middle East could also become democratic, because it was all about leaders making political choices. And if you believe that, then where should you spend your democracy promotion money? On ensuring that there are free and fair elections. Immediately, because political competition creates democracy. You should spend your money on supporting civil society and ensuring judicial independence and so on and so forth. The truth is that American foreign policy makers don't really know where to spend their money, because they don't have a theory of democratization. The US has very strong institutions for regime destruction, the Pentagon, the United States Air Force, but it does not have comparable institutions for regime construction, okay? I think the appetite today for state building anywhere in the world, in the aftermath of Afghanistan and Iraq, is very, very low. But some people would argue that it's not that state building is impossible, and democratic state building is impossible. It's just that we don't know how to do it, because we've never invested in it. There are no institutions for regime construction. You know, the Pentagon has the Secretary of Defense. The chief democracy promotion officer is some third-ranking diplomat that everybody ignores, who has a little office somewhere in the basement of the State Department. Okay? There is an institutional problem here. Finally, before I get to the my final point about these 7 hypotheses, I'm going to run through them very quickly. Even at its height, the US spent no more than about $2.5 billion a year on direct democracy assistance, globally. Okay, I'm not counting the money here that was spent on Iraq and Afghanistan, which one can argue, yes or no, was this about democracy promotion, yes or no? Just as an anecdote, I checked in 2000, I checked this for an article that I wrote in 2008. Americans spent almost $6 billion on candy for Halloween. Okay, so the United States government spends $2.5 billion a year on democracy promotion. That's not very much, to put it mildly. Okay, running through these very, very quickly. I'm going to put these out there for the panel. And I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Boaz Ganor, in a moment, and then we'll have this as a basis for conversation. Okay, hypothesis number one. Democracy promotion works. America can and should promote democracy to curb terrorism because in the long run, at least, it is the only real antidote to large-scale political violence and radicalization because it works in the long run and it serves America's interests and is commensurate with its values. Okay? The freedom agenda did not fail because it was wrong, but because it was never really attempted. It was never properly attempted. The freedom agenda really existed for about 18 months or 2 years. That's not long enough to see whether it worked or not. Okay? You'd be surprised how many people in think tanks and in policy circles believe passionately in this. Some of them, all of you might, the names might be very familiar to you. Okay, this is hypothesis number one, and we shouldn't take it lightly. Hypothesis number two: America can and should promote democracy to curb terrorism, but it needs to adopt a thick, gradualist, long-term, developmental model of democracy promotion. It should emphasize modernization, economic development, the rule of law, human rights, not electoralism. Right? It should not rush to promote elections because elections without the social and economic foundations of democracy lead to Hamas coming to power, right? Or in the case of Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay? So what's wrong with American policy is not the vision, but it's the model of democratization that is being pursued. Okay? Hypothesis number two. Hypothesis number three. America can and should promote democracy to curb terrorism, but only if it gets serious about it and invests extensively in resources, figuring out what works and what doesn't, and developing a long-term strategy for regime construction, both bilaterally and multilaterally with allies throughout the world and through international institutions like the World Bank, like the IMF, like the UN, like the EU, like the OSCE. The list goes on and on. Let me give you a very current example of this thinking. Egypt is currently negotiating a $4.8 billion deal with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and a $1 billion loan forgiveness from the United States. Egypt desperately needs this money. I'm not even talking about the military aid for now. Morsi desperately needs this money because Morsi is now in power and the Egyptian economy has fallen off a cliff. And in order to show that the Muslim Brotherhood can govern responsibly, if ever there was a moment for conditionality, for the United States to attach some conditions, for example, that no more Coptic churches should be burnt in Egypt, that women's rights should be respected, that corruption should be tackled properly, some would argue that this is the moment to do it, because Morsi really needs this money. Okay? So, and if the United States could team up with Japan, with the EU, with the World Bank, with everybody, I'm putting the Chinese aside for the moment, that's a separate issue, a very complicated issue, especially in Africa, we could create the kind of leverage with American resources that would really help bring change. Okay, that's hypothesis number 3. Hypothesis number 4 goes something like this. Democracy will not convince Al-Qaeda. Those in the jihadist hardcore can only be defeated through military and law enforcement means. We're not going to change them. But that doesn't matter. Because what democracy can do is to prevent those most susceptible to extremist recruitment, tens of millions of especially young, frustrated, futureless Arab men, from turning to political violence by giving them an alternative outlet for peaceful, constructive political expression. Okay? So we're not going to defeat Al-Qaeda through democracy promotion, but we're going to help dry the swamp of tens of millions of potential recruits that without democracy are going to turn to violent outlets because they simply don't have an alternative. Okay? Hypothesis number 4. Hypothesis number 5, which I've stolen directly from Alberto Abadi, goes something like this. This is Abadi's graph, and he shows that he ranks terrorist risk versus levels of political freedom, right? This is really low political freedom and high political freedom. And you see what Abadi's argument is? Very closed repressive regimes, Saudi Arabia, Uzbekistan, North Korea, the list goes on and on, are actually pretty good at containing international terrorism. They have sophisticated mechanisms of repression. They control media, they restrict internet, therefore they control the educational system and so on and so forth. They're actually pretty good at making sure that risk of terrorism is low. As countries open up, or as they disintegrate into civil war or a situation of insurgency, you have a spike in levels of risk from terrorism. But, Abadi says, once you cross a critical threshold of political freedom, that risk greatly diminishes. So this is the argument that says, short term, this is going to cost us. We're going to push for democratization. There's going to be a temporary spike in terrorism. But if we persist and we insist on greater political liberalization, eventually we're going to emerge out of that dark, violent tunnel to the other side, which is democratic peace, right? Because terrorism does not emanate from liberal democracy. An interesting argument, okay? A policy prescription for this would say, only promote democracy, okay, unless you're willing to tolerate a tremendous amount of international terrorism, only promote democracy in those countries around the world where you're pretty convinced that you're going to be able to emerge out of that transitional period quickly enough so that this interim period of spike of terrorism and violence is not prohibitively costly. Okay? An interesting argument. Hypothesis number 6, America cannot and should not try to promote democracy because variables measuring democracy and degree of economic openness are not significant predictors of terrorism. This is the James Piazza argument. The issue is not the presence or lack of democracy, but it is a question of political stability. People confuse the tyranny-terror link with the political instability failed state terrorism link. You see the argument? So the problem here is not autocracy. The problem here is not political tyranny. The problem is political instability and state failure. Okay? And yes, there does tend to be a correlation between state failure and autocracy, because autocracy tends to be illegitimate and illegitimacy is an instigating factor of state failure. But we shouldn't conflate the two things. If North Korea or Saudi Arabia are deeply undemocratic, but they're stable politically, they're not going to produce the kind of problems that we're trying to fight. Finally, America should not seek to actively promote democracy to curb terrorism because deliberate democracy promotion doesn't work. If anything, what matters is not what America does in terms of active democracy promotion, but what America is, whether it is hegemonic in its international influence or not. So according to this rationale, promoting democracy is a waste of time. The United States should follow the idea, the notion that physician, heal thyself. The United States should focus on making sure that it regains international dominance and international influence, because that is the best way in the long term to make sure that the spread of capitalist, liberal, democratic ideas spreads around the world. Thank you very much. I hope I provided you with enough sufficiently provocative ideas for this discussion. Let me now turn to and introduce our speakers. I'd like to introduce a man who really needs no introduction here, but I know he likes it. Dr. Boaz Ganor, our director, our deputy dean. Well, He really does need no introduction. Boaz, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amichai. Actually, I think that your introduction is a very good platform to take it from here and to share with you some of my thoughts about the question that you have posed to the panel. And I would like to start with an anecdote. About 3.5 years ago, I was spending my sabbatical year as a Koret Distinguished Fellow at Hoover Institute. Actually, Professor Small is now doing the exact position at Hoover Institute, and I envy him. This was a very interesting time because this was the election year in the United States when President Obama was elected. I'm sure all of you remember what was the first American new administration, Obama administration, step in the foreign affairs arena immediately after he was elected. That was the Cairo speech. President Obama decided, a few weeks after he was elected, to fly from all places, by the way. He could choose many Arab countries, many Muslim countries. He chose Cairo. And probably he chose Cairo because he knew that the leader of Egypt, at that particular time and many years before that, is the best ally of the United States in the Muslim and the Arab world, and I refer to President Mubarak. So he chose to fly to Cairo and to give his first foreign policy speech in Cairo itself, and to send his message and convey his message to the Muslim world. Immediately, a few hours after the speech in Cairo, I was asked to be interviewed by an American TV station. And the first question that they posed to me was, what is the reaction in Israel towards the speech in Cairo? So my answer was, look, I now live temporarily in the Bay Area, not in Israel, and I don't think I can represent Israel. But on the other hand, I'm an Israeli, and even if I don't have the answer, I will have some answer for you. So I think that in Israel we have mixed feelings toward the speech in Cairo. They said, can you elaborate on that? I said, of course. It's a combination of hope and concern. Concern is because when we analyze the content of this speech, it seems to us that it's quite simplistic, using many buzzwords, but it doesn't really get into the complexity, the problems, the many gray colors of the situation that the Muslim world is facing now, that the Arab world is facing now, that the Middle East is facing now. The hope is that maybe the message, this message that was conveyed by President Obama, is the right thing to do, and we are wrong. And if this is the case, then probably it would lead to something which would be very positive, and we will be one of the benefactors of this change of hearts in the Muslim world. The second question they posed to me is, what is the reaction of the Jewish community in the Bay Area to the speech in Cairo? And I said, look, I definitely do not represent the Jewish community in the Bay Area. But since you've asked me, I think that there is a mixed feelings in the Jewish community in the Bay Area, which is a combination of hope and concern. So they were confused, and they said, so what's the difference between the reaction in Israel and the reaction of the Jews in the Bay Area? I said, look, in Israel we have a lot of concern and very little hope. In the Bay Area there is a lot of hope and very little concern. I have to say that in a retrospective point of view, my concern only grew since then. And what I would try to share with you and explain why this concern was growing up, it actually connects the dots in a way that I would argue leads to a better understanding of what led to the so-called Arab Spring, these revolutions in the Arab and Muslim countries. And I will try to tie that not just to the American foreign policy, but maybe even especially to the American counter-terrorism policy, as weird as it sounds. So I see a direct connection between this triangle of American foreign policy, or counter-terrorism policy, the Arab Spring, and the phenomenon of terrorism. When I'm saying that my concern grew after the speech in Cairo, I can point out another specific point of time. This was when I read, about 2.5 years ago, when I read the public statement that was given by John Brennan, the White House advisor for counterterrorism, which spelled out, first time, the new American counterterrorism policy. I think it was in a speech he gave in Brookings or another Washingtonian institute. And one of his first statements was something along the lines of, terrorism is not the enemy of the United States. Oh, Mr. John Brennan, you are not the advisor for human rights for the president. You are the advisor of counterterrorism. You cannot even imply that terrorism is not the enemy of the United States. Yeah, I know, you are playing with words. Sometimes I do that as a scholar as well. And you are saying something which sounds reasonable. Terrorism is a tactic. A tactic cannot be an enemy. Therefore, terrorism is not the enemy. Okay. But there was another statement which was more troublesome than the first one. And the other statement was, again, something along the lines of Islamists and jihadists are not the enemy of the United States. And there was a very scholarly explanation, what is Islam, what is Islamism, what is jihadism, and it has nothing to do with terrorism. Well, in order to understand the problem of that statement, I wrote an op-ed a day, 2 days after that, and the title was, if jihadists and Islamists are not the enemy of the United States, then who is the enemy of the United States? I was arguing there and I was asking the question, what is the message that you are conveying to your allies in the Muslim world, those pragmatic, moderate Muslim leaders, that their life is being threatened on a daily basis by the jihadists and the Islamists? By the way, why? Because they are being regarded as American allies. And now you are saying the jihadists and the Islamists are not your enemy? What is the message? And I spelled it out. What is the message that you are conveying to President Mubarak that might be assassinated on a daily basis and as an outcome of being regarded as American ally? This was a year before the Arab Spring started. What should have been the message, at least in my view? For that, I would share with you another anecdote. A few years ago, I was asked to give a talk in Brussels. And before I was giving my talk there was another speaker. He was an imam, a religious cleric, Muslim religious cleric, coming from Sudan. And he was very persuasive. And he preached to the European audience. And he said to them, how dare you refer to Islam as if it is something to do with terrorism? Do you know what terrorism is all about? Do you know what Islam is all about? Islam is the religion of peace and clemency. Do you know what's jihad? You're using the term jihadi terrorism all the time. Do you know what's jihad all about? Jihad is all about doing those good deeds and not those atrocities. And he was persuasive. Then was my turn. He was still in the room, so I referred to him and I said, in the opening of my words, I said to him, my friend, I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart, sincerely, that you took the trouble to fly all over the way from Sudan to Brussels to share with us those two important messages. And I really meant that. It's important for us to know that Islam is not equal terrorism. It's important for us to know that jihad has nothing to do with those atrocities, just the opposite. But between you and me, my friend, I don't really understand why did you bother to fly all over the way from Sudan to Brussels to share with us those two important messages instead of staying in Sudan or crossing to Egypt or crossing to Pakistan or Afghanistan or Iraq or I can name so many countries altogether and tell those people which are beheading innocent civilians under the name of Islam, raising the flag of jihad while they do that. Tell them that what they do is against Islamic verdicts, it's against Quranic verdicts. If you have a task in life is to do exactly that, not to preach that to the Western society, to preach it to the Muslims themselves. Because you have a problem in Islam, not a problem with Islam, but a problem in Islam. And the only one who can win and solve this problem are the Muslims themselves. And this is your task. I would expect President Obama to say those words. God forbid, Islam is not the enemy of the United States. How come? But you have a problem, my friends, that you need to solve for your sake, for the sake of your countries, of your region, of the whole world. That's in my view, was one of the first problems that led to, or mistakes that led to the Arab Spring. The second thing is the differences between Bush administration counterterrorism policy and Obama administration counterterrorism policy. Now, in order to analyze any counterterrorism policy, let me suggest to go back to what I believe is the embryonic understanding of what is terrorism all about. I call it the equation of terrorism. Very simple mathematical equation with two factors: motivation and operational capability. If you bear this in mind, you can solve any case of terrorism. Not only that, in some cases you can even predict who, where, and why, and when will conduct a terrorist attack, and which type of terrorist attack. Motivation and operational capability. It means when a certain group of people has both motivation to launch terrorist attacks and operational capability that allows them to materialize the motivation, then a terrorist attack or a terrorist campaign would occur. Why it's so important formula, not only in order to predict terrorism, but also in order to counter terrorism. Because what is the formula of counterterrorism? The same formula: motivation and operational capability. It means that if you would like to be effective in your counterterrorism efforts, what you need is to lower down the operational capability of the terrorists. How do you do that? By operative measures. You arrest them, you kill them, you destroy their warehouses, and so on and so forth. By that you delude their operational capability. But at the same time, what you need to do is to lower down the motivation that leads to terrorism. Sometimes leaders around the world tend to forget that, tend to cling only to one part of the equation. You could find in the history of counterterrorism those experts and those leaders that suggest to lower down motivation, that will solve the problem, or those who are saying, let us win the war by conducting operative measures and offensive measures, that will solve the problem. The only solution, real solution for terrorism, is dealing with both factors at the same time, lowering both motivation and operational capability of the terrorists. Easier said than done, because there is an internal contradiction between the two. If you like to lower down the motivation that leads to terrorism, and you like to lower down the operational capability, once you attack them in order to lower down their capability, like it or not, you raise their motivation to retaliate. That is being called the boomerang effect in the literature of counterterrorism. Why did I share this with you? Because when I'm trying to analyze the differences between President Obama counterterrorism policy and President Bush counterterrorism policy, you would be surprised. Both of them, and probably their staffs, understood and still understand this equation. Both of them were trying and are trying to be effective in both tracks at the same time, lowering down motivation that leads to terrorism and operational capability. But if you ask me what is the main difference between those two policies, is where did they put the emphasis? President Bush put the emphasis on countering the operational capability of the terrorists. And yes, he tried to do some things in countering motivation as well, but that was not the focus of his policy. President Obama is putting a focus on the counterterrorism or countering the motivation of terrorism, and he's doing also a lot of activities in counter-operational capability. And we saw the killing of bin Laden and al-Awlaki and so on and so forth. He doesn't neglect that. But the focus is on counter-motivation. By the way, this difference between the two policies, it's a natural one. You might be even surprised, I would be surprised of what I'm saying now. Even if you take the historical point of time and you change the two leaders And if you would put Obama as the president of the United States immediately after the attack of 9/11, he would behave almost exactly as President Bush. Maybe not getting into Iraq, but all the rest would be quite the same. The Patriot Law, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. And probably President Bush maybe would not behave exactly as President Obama, but he would definitely change the emphasis. It's natural. After you are being attacked in reference to such a huge atrocity like 9/11, any democratic leader is being pushed by his own people that wants to see that such an attack would not occur again. I was in the United States when 9/11 occurred. Few hours after the attack, I was interviewed by so many media channels. And in some cases, even the public at large could call into the studio and ask me questions. And the question that was repeated on that very sad day of 9/11, the question that was repeated and I was asked to answer was, why the hell don't we nuke them? Nobody asked the question, who is them? Who are you going to nuke? What will be the implications of nuking them? What they want is to see concrete, harsh steps that will prevent further attacks like that. And this is a natural thing, especially and maybe mainly in a democracy. In a state where the leaders are alluded to public pressure, to public opinion. In dictatorships, the leaders can do whatever they want. They don't give a damn about those pressures which are coming bottom up. So the main differences between those two policies, President Obama and President Bush, was the emphasis on one of the two factors of the formula of terrorism. But there was another difference. Because as said before, both administrations tried to lower down motivation, each one in his own ways. But they defined the source of the motivation, the root causes, differently. President Bush and his administration believed that the root cause that led to 9/11 and those similar atrocities in other places is an extreme ideology, religious ideology, Islamic ideology, not Islam, but miscalculation of Islam, misinterpretation of Islam. And they refer to that as the root cause that led to the birth of those extremists. President Obama was putting a finger and was arguing, his administration was arguing, that the root cause is regional conflicts, local extremism, and so on and so forth. Now, I would like to suggest to differ between root causes and instrumental causes. And I would argue that in reference to terrorism, we should consider both. Root causes are really the embryonic reason behind terrorism. In my view, this is ideologies that leads extremists to take one step further and to promote them by conducting violence, political violence and terrorism. Instrumental causes are excuses that are being misused by those extremists and serving as a very good glue in order to unite the people around them. Because it's sometimes much more difficult to persuade somebody because of this or the other extreme ideology to commit a suicide. But if you cling to something which is very concrete to his actual life, and here you can mention a lot of reasons. It could be occupation. It could be poverty. Those are not root causes, as many scholars, unfortunately, refers to. Those are instrumental causes. And if you would not find this instrumental cause, you will find another instrumental cause. The problem is the root cause. And this is, in my view, another difference between the two administrations, how they defined and what was, in their eyes, the root cause that led to terrorism. I'm not arguing that United States created the Arab Spring. But I would argue that these concepts and those policies of United States gave the backwind that led this epidemic process of the Arab Spring. The term Arab Spring, in my view, actually reflects the American euphoria in reference to that process, at least in the first, maybe the first year or 2 years. And I would argue, and here I cling to what Amichai was presenting, that this is an outcome, I refer to that as an American naivete, cultural naivete. And definitely it's not a partisan thing, it's a bipartisan phenomenon. I had the pleasure and the honor to listen and to discuss with Condoleezza Rice those issues, those matters of democratization, terrorism, and so on and so forth. And I was amazed to hear that although her administration didn't predict that Hamas is going to win the elections, she was not that concerned, and still not that concerned, from the fact that Hamas won the election. And the explanation was that this is a democratic process. And even if fundamentalists are winning the election, well, the public is smart. At the end of the day, they will get rid of them. In my view, the American, in general, of course, I cannot generalize, but the American perception in general has two faults. One is the belief that democracy is a miracle solution to violence, political violence and terrorism. I would argue exactly the opposite, and I think you gave some other scholars which are saying the same. Modern terrorism is focusing in attacking democracies. It's a whole, not lecture, a whole course to explain connection between open media, public opinion, and so I will not get into it. It doesn't mean that you would not find terrorism in dictatorships and tyrannic leaderships and so on and so forth. But modern terrorism is mainly attacking democracies. So democratization is not a miracle solution for terrorism. But the second mistake, maybe even more problematic, is the belief that free election is democracy. Free election is a very important apparatus of democracy, no doubt about it. Nobody should underestimate that. But the way I understand democracy is first and foremost a set of values. Liberal democratic concepts, civil society, women's lib, the right of minorities, and so on and so forth. That's what is democracy all about. And yes, you need very important apparatuses like free election. But when you take free election and you say, okay, anyone who was winning free election is now a legitimate entity, a legitimate organization, a legitimate government, then you might cause much more trouble than what you had before in pseudo-democratic regimes or non-democratic regimes and so on and so forth. When fundamentalists are winning elections, this is one man, one time, one vote. Not more than that. And with all due respect, we have some examples. Take Iran, this full democratic state. Does anybody really believe that the elections that were held there were democratic? People actually, it reflects the notion of the people and the feelings of the people and the wish to change the regime. I don't want to get too much into the implications of the Arab Spring, because I took it for granted, and maybe some of you, definitely some of my colleagues, do not take it for granted, that the Arab Spring is a negative process. So I would say maybe one or two words about that, at least when I refer to terrorism, the short-term implications and the long-term implications are very worrying. We see it already. I mean, a year ago when we talked about it, this was hypothetical, but now it's quite clear. Look what is happening in Libya, in Yemen, in the Sinai Peninsula, and now also in Syria. And it's not going to end there. Because after Syria, you would have other countries in my view. And there is a scholarly debate here, which Peter Newman was referring to in his words in the plenary session. And I would quote another prominent scholar, American Palestinian, Shibli Talhami. And Shibli Talhami wrote an op-ed immediately after Mubarak fell. And the message that he conveyed in the op-ed was, this is a nightmare of Al-Qaeda. I beg to differ. Yes, Peter Newman explained that, and also Shibli, that this is a nightmare because Al-Qaeda was conveying the message all of those years that to achieve the ultimate goal of creating global caliphate state, there is only one way to get to that. And this is by provoking violence and extreme terrorism and so on and so forth. And now, reality proves that there are other ways, much more peaceful ways. With a question mark, is it really peaceful in some countries, but let's forget that. Other ways. And this is a slap in the face of Al-Qaeda. Well, you are underestimating Al-Qaeda if you believe in that. Al-Qaeda are a very notorious bunch of, I wouldn't use the term lunatic, but definitely extremists. They are happy trigger. They want to see blood being shedded, that's true, but they have a concrete goal that they are trying to achieve. They want to impose caliphate states in different Arab and Muslim countries and then to use this platform in order to impose that all around the world. That's the ultimate goal. You don't need to be a counterterrorism expert. You don't need to even to understand Arabic because they say it loud and clear in every possible language and every possible media. Anything that promotes that ultimate goal is not a nightmare for Al-Qaeda whatsoever. So to sum up, and not to leave you with a gloomy face as I see here, I would say that still there are a lot of things that can be done and should be done in order to change the course, the negative course of history. First of all, I think that there is a need to strengthen those Arab and Muslim countries that didn't fall into this dangerous process yet. For example, Jordan, some Gulf countries, and so on and so forth. They should be strengthened before the process starts and not trying to save whatever is possible to save after this process starts. Crucial recommendation would be you should understand the rationale of those fundamentalists. Don't refer to them as lunatics. They have their own rationale. They have their own calculus of cost and benefits. And if there is a task of the scholarly community, is exactly that. To learn and to educate. To understand much better their calculus of cost and benefits, their rationale. It's a different one than the Western. And the tendency in the Western society, in the scholarly community, is to either believe that their rationale is exactly like ours, or refer to them as lunatics because you do not understand the rationale. They have a rationale, it's a different rationale than the Western rationale. Understanding that, it's crucial. The third recommendation, stop being naive. Don't legitimize those extremists and fundamentalists that win the elections. I can talk a lot about how free the election is or not, when you are using divine commands in order to persuade the people to vote this way or the other way. I will not get into that right now. But don't be naive. The terrorism arena is now shifting to a new phase, the phase that we refer to, and former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert referred to that. He didn't use the term, but we call it the hybrid terrorist organizations. Those organizations, terrorist organizations, which are active at the same time, both at the terrorism arena and the political welfare education, what we call the Dawah arena. So they are being legitimized because there's pseudo-legitimate activity, and people turn a blind eye to the fact that they are still a terrorist organization, and I would argue more dangerous than a classic terrorist organization, because they have this legitimacy camouflage. Stop being naive. Don't give legitimization to hybrid terrorist organizations. Don't give legitimization to those fundamentalist and extremist regimes that wins elections. And the last recommendation, and this will refer exactly to one of the 7 models that you define, is the problem is not with the spread out of democracy, God forbid. The problem is with the model of democracy that you take, at least in my view. And the ingredients and the guidelines and the indicators should be the level of liberalism, civil society, values, and not just the apparatuses and the processes themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Boaz, for putting such a rich presentation on the table and getting us off to a start on our conversation. I want to invite Professor Joshua, my good friend Josh Teitelbaum, to the podium. Josh is really a leading historian and expert on the Middle East. He's a professor at the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at Bar-Ilan University, but his career is truly international. He holds several research positions in Israel and abroad, not least at Stanford University, where he's a visiting fellow and a member of the Herbert and Jane Dwight Working Group on Islamism and the International Order, the Hoover Institution. He's also a visiting fellow at CDDRL, the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law at Stanford. His latest book is Saudi Arabia and the New Strategic Landscape, the Arab Spring. Josh, the podium is yours.
I think I have the 2 hard acts to follow, but we'll see how it goes. Okay. So we're here to assess the idea that promoting democracy acts in one way or another to curb terrorism. And I've been asked to talk about U.S. democracy promotion in Saudi Arabia. So we must remember that 15 of the 9/11 hijackers were Saudi Arabian. So the question is a valid one. A lot of the funding for terrorism came from Saudi Arabia. Some still does. So it's a valid question. But as will soon be apparent to you all, you'll see while I've subtitled my talk, Talking the Talk Without Walking the Walk. This could also be called Democracy Promotion in Saudi Arabia. Be careful what you wish for. Terrorism, of course, is worth stopping without recourse to democracy promotion. But like many nations, particularly democracies, the idea of sustained military action, unrelated to an improvement in the lives of the society, which is the object of that military action, this is usually considered unpalatable in democracies. That's why the British had their white man's burden, or the French had their mission civilisatrice. So it's worth briefly recalling some of the cultural and ideological foundations of the U.S. response to 9/11. We heard a bit about this from Amichai. because this really influences how America pursued its post-9/11 policy in the Gulf and in the Middle East as a whole. So as the U.S. administration set about seeking explanations and ways to respond beyond the military response, it drew on some really deeply held ideas about America's role in the world. These ideas were derived from the very stuff that has made America what it is. The idea that America has a mission in the world, one that has at times been carried out with religious zeal. George Kennan once remarked that U.S. foreign policy has been periodically affected by periods of evangelical idealism dating from America's Puritan heritage. One of the ideas brought about by that very Puritan heritage was the idea of manifest destiny. Some of you may remember this from high school history, the Americans here. This was first coined by politicians in the 1840s. It has earlier roots, though, but it was an explanation for America's expanse across the continent. And the notion developed that the United States had a mission to settle North America. And indeed, most nations often have a sense of national destiny or purpose that guides foreign and sometimes domestic policy. When President Wilson wanted to prepare the American people in his famous war message before World War I in April 1917, he actually waxed evangelical. He stated that America is privileged to spend her blood and her might for the principles that gave her birth and happiness and the peace which she has treasured. God helping her, she can do no other. And then famously, as has already been mentioned, the world must be made safe for democracy. In post-9/11 America, the idea developed that America could best defend itself against terrorism by fostering democracy in the Middle East. And just as manifest destiny had often been conceived in missionary and religious terms, so the U.S. democracy efforts in the Middle East were not bereft of the same powerful religious symbolism. I want to give you some examples of this. We'll start with the Bush administration, the last Bush administration. In his January, President Bush, in his January 2003 State of the Union message, stated the following: Americans are a free people who know that freedom is the right of every person and the future of every nation. The liberty we prize is not America's gift to the world, it is God's gift to humanity. And he repeated this at his famous National Endowment for Democracy speech in November. Liberty, I'm quoting, liberty is the plan of heaven for humanity. Bush was also admitted that he was influenced by the book written by former Israeli minister Natan Sharansky. This is the, Amichai mentioned, the democratic peace theory. In this book, Sharansky argued that it was in the nature of democracies not to be belligerent, and it followed that if countries that had populations which did not like the United States could be made democratic, they would cease to be enemies of America. And Bush said that the book summarized how I feel. That's a direct quote. So the 9/11 hijackers were Arabs and Muslims, and therefore democracy promotion, drawing on this deep reserve of American sentiment, became the cornerstone of U.S. policy toward the Muslim and the Arab world. The Bush administration, their reasoning went something like this: if they were more like us, they would like us. If they were more like us, they would like us. But the seemingly endless war in Iraq, the skyrocketing price of oil after 9/11, this further focused the policy and public imagination on this region, the Middle East. If these states liberalized, so went the argument, they'd be more likely to be stable and to support the U.S. agenda. But to do just that, the administration had to make clear that it was changing its policy, its previous policy of supporting friendly but authoritarian regimes. Secretary Rice declared at the American University of Cairo in June 2005, "For 60 years, my country, the United States, pursued stability at the expense of democracy in this region here in the Middle East, and we achieved neither. Now we are taking a different course. We are supporting the democratic aspirations of all people." So this was kind of an apology for supporting dictatorial regimes in the Middle East. And from this we have Bush's freedom agenda, the support of democracy, and America's non-democratic supporters in the region, the Gulf countries, Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, they were all put on notice. Well, what did the Bush administration say specifically about Saudi Arabia? Here, things are less clear. There's a web page of the Freedom Agenda from the previous administration, and there, this is what Bush had to say about Saudi Arabia. He urged Saudi Arabia to move more towards freedom, that Saudi Arabia had confronted religious extremism. Saudi Arabia had engaged in interfaith dialogue, but Saudi Arabia still had a great distance to travel, and the United States would continue to press Saudi Arabia to open up their political system. He said similar things at his NED, National Endowment Democracy speech, that they had to give the Saudi people a greater role in their society, and Secretary Rice also followed with similar kinds of comments. Hers were actually the most strident. She said that people pay an unfair price for exercising their basic rights. There are 3 individuals in prison. This should not be a crime in any country. But this is about as strident as the Bush administration ever got, okay? The talk of democracy promotion in Saudi Arabia, they talk really more about reform, less about democracy promotion, but really they weren't walking the walk. In other words, this was just lip service. Now, when the Obama administration was elected, it's very clear, those of us who we were at Stanford at the time, we were associated with the Center for Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, and the head of that center, Ambassador Michael McFaul, now ambassador to Russia, he had advised the Obama campaign, but when he went into administration, they made him head in the National Security Council, head of the Russian affairs, and not to deal with democracy promotion at all. I mean, they really weren't interested in this issue of democracy promotion. We rarely heard of Bush's Middle East Partnership Initiative. Anybody remember that? MEPI, that was talked about a lot at one time. It was mostly just talk about reform here and there. And after all, as we've heard, the record was pretty mixed. Hamas in Gaza, a Shiite-dominated Iraq, a mess in Afghanistan. You know, the idea was kind of let's reevaluate. Where are we going with all this? And for Obama, the key to getting support for the U.S. in the Middle East was not having the Middle East be more like America, but having America get out of the Middle East. In his view, this was the cause of terrorism. So he wound down the war in Iraq and is on his way out of Afghanistan. And I would say before the Arab revolutions of last year, it seems that Obama was more inclined to go, according to Amichai's hypothesis number 7. We received the PowerPoint presentation in advance, so we could. And this was the idea that America should not seek to actively promote democracy to curb terrorism because deliberate democracy promotion doesn't work. I think that was the main point I take from that hypothesis 7. Now, if you look, I'm quoting to you from a lot of speeches, but this is where we get kind of the direction of the policy. Obama's main, we'll call it his Arab Spring speech, was May 19th, 2011. And there's one key sentence for those of us who looked at Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries and U.S. democracy promotion. There's one key sentence there. He says, not every country will follow our particular form of representative democracy, and there will be times when our short-term interests don't align perfectly with our long-term vision for the region. There'll be times when our short-term interests don't align perfectly with our long-term vision for the region. And then he goes on to lay out some core principles: universal rights, freedom of assembly, and so forth, equality for men and women under the rule of law, and the right to choose your own leaders, whether you live in Baghdad or Damascus, Sana'a, or Tehran. Not Riyadh, okay? It's not mentioned there. Now, this kind of statement is basically the talk. This is what is being talked about. And this kind of phrasing that we're talking about is known in speechwriters as a cutout, basically giving Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries a pass. Okay, because U.S. short-term interests require a stable Saudi Arabia and a stable Gulf. For the time being, that means that the current ruling family should rule. And they need to be stable for two obvious reasons: oil and Iran. Okay? Stability, not democracy. That's the priority where these countries are concerned. If a little bit of reform can be thrown in, that's nice. It can sweeten the authoritarian pill, but the key for the U.S. is stability, not democracy. So, briefly, oil, we don't have to say really too much about how important that is, but Saudi Arabia has about 1/5 of the world's proven oil reserves. It's the largest oil producer and exporter of petroleum liquids in the world. It has the world's largest production capacity. It's a key supplier of oil to the United States, Europe, and Asia. It has increased its oil production to make up for the Iranian shortfalls due to sanctions, and it's storing millions of barrels at home and in its markets. In fact, if you're an American and you know that your country has something called a strategic petroleum reserve, I think it might be perhaps more correct to look at the United States Petroleum Reserve as not being located in Texas and Louisiana, but being located in Riyadh. In general, the United States has been increasing its oil imports from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is behind Canada, sometimes Mexico, in being one of the major exporters to the United States. It's a huge player in the international oil market. So again, stability there is far more important than democracy. Now, how did the U.S. react to the ramifications of the Arab revolutions, their manifestations in Saudi Arabia and particularly in Bahrain? Well, this so-called Arab Spring was the kind of development. By the way, you know, this term, the Arab Spring, even the Arabs don't use that word anymore. Okay? The Arabs call it the revolutions. They don't call it the Arab Spring. Again, I go with what Boaz says here. This is kind of the newspapers in the West kind of inventing this word. They don't use it. So this so-called Arab Spring was the kind of development that causes states to scramble for a sure footing amidst major changes. Heading a superpower with multiple interests across the globe, the Obama administration was torn between liberal interventionists or idealists who saw U.S. interests as being nearly synonymous with democracy promotion, and pragmatists, also known as realists, who believed that U.S. interests were much wider and that many other factors had to be taken into consideration. But the Saudis are a regional power, and they had to deal specifically with the revolutionary fires licking at their borders in Bahrain, in Egypt, and in Yemen. Their interests were more clear-cut, the threats closer by, and therefore much more immediate. And as the United States searched for a clear and meaningful response to the events in Egypt, Bahrain, and eventually in Saudi Arabia itself, the Saudi royal family was puzzled and eventually angered by Washington's policy. In the Saudi view, Washington had treated Mubarak shabbily, and it was reported that King Abdullah had actually upbraided President Obama about this very issue. The royal family was asking, is this any way to treat a U.S. ally? The head of the Al Arabiya satellite channel, a prominent journalist, Saudi journalist named Abdurrahman al-Rashid, he wrote that Obama was encouraging Iran and meddling in Egyptian affairs. The Egyptians in the street would not requite the U.S. love. Now, in Saudi Arabia, while there were a few minor protests at home, the Saudis were mostly concerned by what was happening in neighboring Bahrain. In Bahrain, there was massive violent rioting by the Shiite majority and brutal suppression by the Sunni ruling family known as the Al-Khalifa family. Now, we have to understand, I'm not sure how many people really know how Saudi Arabia relates to Bahrain. Saudi Arabia relates to Bahrain like the United States relates to Puerto Rico. Okay? Nearly apart. 51st state. Practically that. It's a fellow royal family. They have a history that goes way back. They're separated by a causeway of, I think, about 16 miles. And it's a very important place for Saudi Arabia. The Saudis were not about to stand idly while Bahrain was threatened. Well, the United States wanted to calm the Saudis down. They sent a lot of dignitaries, important people, the head of the Joint Chief of Staff at the time, Michael McMullen. But they were kind of in this mode of supporting democracy. And the State Department spokesman, P.J. Crowley, said the United States supported the right of peaceful assembly, including in Saudi Arabia. This drove the Saudis absolutely nuts. The foreign minister was livid. He said Saudi supported dialogue. Change will only come through the citizens of the country and not through foreign fingers. We don't need them. We will cut any finger that crosses into the kingdom. So relations appeared to be under strain, and this led to a period of tension between the two countries. The Saudis were also very disappointed by the Obama's administration's handling of the crisis in Bahrain. For Riyadh, Washington's lack of resolve toward what the Saudis perceived as a real Iranian threat was not easy to stomach. After all, you remember, we all know from WikiLeaks, right, that it was King Abdullah who had asked the United States to cut off the head of the snake. He was referring to Iran. And here, Iran was meddling in Bahrain, the next-door neighbor, the Puerto Rico of Saudi Arabia. And Iran stood to gain more than any other foreign country if the Shiites took over Bahrain. Now, the Saudis would have preferred that the United States mount a serious defense of the Al-Khalifa ruling family, but that wasn't in the cards. They tried to negotiate, the United States was involved trying to negotiate an agreement with the opposition in Bahrain. This really didn't work, and all the United States could do was urge restraint. Okay, the Saudis wanted to hear none of this. So what happened was, just as when the United States was in Bahrain trying to arrange this agreement, the Saudis invaded Bahrain. Okay, at the invitation, they sent in troops, the Saudi Arabian National Guard. They sent them in, and basically, that's how the whole issue ended. The Saudis were not going to have any of this United States pussyfooting going on. Now, these differences about Bahrain, about Egypt, how to handle all these matters, this does not mean that the United States and Saudi Arabia are about to part ways. It's far from it. There's still deeply entrenched defense, procurement, and training relations, and the Iranian enemy is not going away. But relations were shaken. But we have to remember, Washington is far and away the main arms supplier for Saudi Arabia. The United States continues to train its troops. In addition to arms deals worth over $60 billion announced to Congress in October 2010, in the past year or so, another $3.7 billion in weapons sales have been announced. These range from Patriot air and missile defense systems to cluster bombs. The United States is also apparently continuing to train a nearly secret facility security force designed to protect sensitive oil installations. This is scheduled to reach a force strength of about 35,000. Okay, so the United States is very involved in the defense of Saudi Arabia. As of December 2011, there were nearly 1,000 active duty military personnel in the kingdom, U.S. military personnel in the kingdom, and thousands of civilian contractees. So what about Bahrain? Okay, where are we heading in Bahrain, and what about the U.S. in Bahrain? Well, in Bahrain, the U.S. talks the democracy talk, but it doesn't really walk the democracy walk. The Obama cutout for Persian Gulf monarchies, like Bahrain, that we saw from his May 19th speech, Obama's May 19th speech, this still obtains. The U.S. the Fifth Fleet of the United States Navy is in Bahrain. The U.S. wants to keep the pressure on Iran. And if we really want to be serious about it, the U.S. is actually following the Saudi lead on Bahrain. And it's actually recently increased arms sales to the minority Sunni regime in Bahrain. So basically, like with another defense partner, Israel, it's clear that the United States and the Saudis will not always see eye to eye, and at times may conceive of security interests differently. Yet in the grand scheme of things, the United States shares with the Saudis and the other GCC countries a desire for stability and the free flow of oil. Iran is a threat to this strategic goal. So it seems that the United States will continue to let the Saudis lead on Bahrain and other internal Saudi issues. Democracy promotion is not really important. The U.S. may speak up occasionally, as it has. This is consistent with U.S. values. But the two countries need each other. And Riyadh knows that when push comes to shove, it can count on the United States. Now, with respect to fighting terrorism, the Saudis don't need democracy. Thank you very much. Okay? They don't need it. Since the mid-2000s, they've done a pretty good job of fighting their own terrorism through co-optation, tribal negotiations, re-education, a general carrot and stick approach. The Saudis are a tribal society. They use tribal mechanisms. I mean, if you are a Saudi member of Al-Qaeda and you're prepared to turn yourself in, you turn yourself in. The government will take care of your debts. They'll take care of your kids. They'll give you a car. They'll do everything, and they'll talk to your father and the head of your tribe and so forth. So that's how they do it. So they put more or less an end to Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia. So this is certainly a rocky stretch in relations between Riyadh and Washington. And as the United States struggles to align its interests with its values, it finds it more difficult to support authoritarian monarchies like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. But values and interests don't neatly align themselves in international relations. While the United States wants to be on the side of democracy and against authoritarianism, the authoritarian Islamic regime in Riyadh is still essential to long-term interests of stability confronting Iran and assuring oil supply. Now, there are voices for change in Saudi Arabia. We hear them all the time, and these are getting stronger. The U.S. likes to point to these as evidence of Washington's efforts, and there has been some movement, but really nothing substantive. Columnist Maureen Dowd once remarked that observing change in Saudi Arabia was like watching a snail on Ambien. So the Saudis will have to consider picking up the pace, but don't look for anything dramatic soon. Now, regarding Amichai's hypotheses, I think the record will show, not just in the case of Saudi Arabia, that some combination of number 6 and number 7 is most warranted. The U.S. needs to promote stability and effective states. In some countries, this might come through democracy. In other countries, democracy might not be so helpful. So it needs a nuanced, regionally sensitive approach. Americans should continue to talk the democracy talk and walk the walk where it is useful. There are certain values that must be maintained because they are a part of the American ethos. But America should lead mostly by example, by continuing to improve its own society based on liberty and individual freedom, equal opportunity for all, and leading the world in science, culture, and education. But as for Saudi Arabia and democratic change or U.S. urging reform, don't hold your breath. Ambien will likely remain the preferred medication of the Saudi snail.
Thank you so much, Josh. This focus on Saudi Arabia, I think, adds a very important dimension to our conversation. I'd like to next invite Mr. Brian Jenkins to address us. Mr. Jenkins joined the United States Army at the age 19. He served with the 7th Special Forces Group in the Dominican Republic and the 5th Special Forces Group in Vietnam. He was commissioned as an infantry officer, became a paratrooper and a captain in the Green Berets. He's a decorated combat veteran. In 1996, Mr. Jenkins was appointed by President Clinton to the White House Commission on Aviation Safety and Security from 1999 to 2000. Brian Jenkins served as an advisor to the National Commission on Terrorism, and in 2000 was appointed to the U.S. Comptroller's General Advisory Board. He's a research associate at the Mineta Transportation Institute, where he directs the continuing research on protecting surface transportation against terrorist attack. His biography is enormously distinguished, and all of us who study this field continuously learned his scholarship. It's a great honor to have Brian Jenkins with us this morning. Thank you, Brian.
You know, when you're third or fourth or fifth in line, you end up tossing out what you were going to say, because you end up more and more reacting to what others are going to say. A comment, I just want to start off with a comment about, this should really be more interactive here, a comment about Boaz's observations on the differences between the Obama and Bush administration's approach to counterterrorism, whether the emphasis is on the operational side of counterterrorism or on dealing with motivations. And there may be some differences there, but I think less than we think. Really what the differences reflect are the situation, the circumstances at the time. I mean, if you go back to the dark hours immediately after 9/11, when we had no idea what was going to happen the next day or the next week, we had no idea of how many more 9/11s might have been in the pipeline on their way, and you know, the officials are meeting in the White House Operations Center. This is a desperate time, the worst attack on the United States since Pearl Harbor, worse than Pearl Harbor. And we have the President and Secretary of State Powell and Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and CIA Director George Tenon, Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. What are we going to do? I mean, someone doesn't leap up and say, promote democracy. It's really not the concern. The concern is we're going to go after these sons of bitches who were responsible for this. That's going to be our first order of business. And so for the years, months and years immediately after 9/11, we pounded on al-Qaeda's operational capabilities. We invaded Afghanistan. We scattered the training camps. We chased them down. There was, as this continued, there was a criticism, an internal criticism of American strategy, is that while we were pounding on these operational capabilities, we really had no front-end strategy and no back-end strategy. And what I mean by that is that there were criticisms that we had given very little thought to how to interrupt the process by which these people were radicalized and recruited into this ongoing enterprise. We had really no programs for political warfare, to use that term, or for above the tactical or psychological operations. We didn't have a back-end strategy. That is, what are we going to do with these people when we get them? Are they enemy combatants, and we're going to hold them for the duration of the hostilities? Are they criminals who we are going to bring to trial? Are they simply sources of intelligence? So we're going to beat the hell out of them and find out what useful information we can get. The mess we have now, the continuing mess we have in terms of how we deal with this, is a consequence of not having given a lot of thought going into it. And It's easy to criticize that now, but that was not what was on people's minds at the time. Now, by the time that 2009, President Obama comes along, and it's a different situation. Al-Qaeda's capabilities, operational capabilities, clearly have been degraded by that time. There's worry about a deteriorating situation in Afghanistan. There's worry about, increasing worry in the United States about what appears to be a spike in homegrown terrorism. We have Nidal Hassan at Fort Hood. We have these other plots that are being discovered. There's embarrassment about the scandals at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, and so it's a completely different situation. What does President Obama do? He reinforces Afghanistan, sends in a lot more troops. We are still going after Al-Qaeda leaders. He increases the drone strikes by a factor of 3 or 4. Actually, I think it was by a factor of 4. We crank up efforts on going after Osama bin Laden, not because, by the way, the Bush administration wasn't paying attention to this. This was simply an opportunity that was presented because the intelligence that had been accumulated was now beginning to create a picture that was going to give the president a shot. The president launches a push to stop homegrown terrorism, and they try to add a front-end strategy. That is, let's try to address this issue of radicalization and recruitment. They also try to add a back-end strategy in shutting down Guantanamo, and that completely flops. That doesn't work at all. So it's not really a shift in emphasis. It's an evolving response to a changing situation. However, there are some subtle nuance differences there, and it has to do with, first of all, I mean, commanders-in-chief in war have to communicate with the home front. They communicate with their political constituents. I mean, they're politicians, after all. And there is, long before 9/11, the prevailing liberal view in terrorism. It's kind of the anti-counter-terrorism view that this is really root causes. That if we address issues of poverty and oppression and untreated water and general unhappiness, that we won't have any more terrorists. And certainly that view does penetrate the administration kind of out on the edges. It's certainly among the constituents, and some of the statements, I think, reflect the response to that particular community. With regard to Amichai's really first-rate presentation of the sort of analyst scholarly view and these charts and everything, I have to admit to being a wonk. I actually look at these things and like stuff like that. At the same time, I'm always bemused by the academic question when we talk about American democracy, how it works, whether we can have democratization as a policy, and it works in practice, but does it work in theory? Let me just touch on really two topics quickly here. One is to underscore a comment that was made by Amichai, and that is the powerful role of democracy and democracy promotion in American national security and foreign policy. It's older and it's deeper than even what was on your particular PowerPoints, and I know you understand that. And then let me touch upon the point is and the headline in advance is that the promotion of democracy, while it appears in the memoirs of former office holders as they write their legacies to American history. And while it appears in the public rhetoric, that is, to resonate both with foreign audiences and, more importantly, again, with a domestic American audience, despite that, the promotion of democracy is not a significant component of American counterterrorism policy. And I'm going to, so let me touch on those. I mean, look, first of all, in terms of the role of democracy promotion in general in American history, I mean, this is really a deeply held notion in the United States that these fundamental rights that go all the way back to what we documented in the Declaration of Independence were inalienable rights. They were universal rights, liberty, freedom, and guaranteed by the fact that people would select their own government. It would not be selected on the basis of the king and the son of the king. Now, promoting that or protecting that has been a key element of American national security and foreign policy, going back 200 years. And again, it was practical. It wasn't simply a belief system, it was practical. Again, I talked about the precarious moments post 9/11. Think of the precarious moments of the United States after the American Revolution, a successful revolution, but this is a tiny little country. It is exhausted by this war, and it is surrounded by the British in the north, who remind us of our precarious position by marching down in 1812 and burning down the capital. On the west, we have the French, and on the south, in Florida, it's the Spanish Empire. And so this new republic is frightened by this. Now, in 1803, we deal with the French. We get enough cash together, and Napoleon's desperate enough, we buy them out. So that means now we got a big Spanish Empire and a big British Empire there. When the Spanish colonies revolt in 1810, we think this is terrific. This is a great idea. And they're successful, and we're with them. That's our safety. But then it appears, by around 1820, they're successful. But is there going to be a pushback from Spain, a pushback from Europe? And President Monroe in 1823 pronounces the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Stay out of our territory. Democracies will be in the New World, and monarchies will be in the Old World. Now, in 1823, that's a pretty gutsy statement for, again, the United States, which was a little bigger than it was in 1781, but still, it's a small country. We continue to push that. When the French install a puppet emperor in Mexico in 1862, not much we can do about it. We're in the midst of a civil war. End of the Civil War, we mobilize an army down on the Mexican frontier and tell the French, you are going. And we help the Mexicans, and the French are kicked out in 1867. You're absolutely right. It was mentioned as protecting democracy when we went into Cuba and Puerto Rico, and probably a little bit cynically so. I think that was just cover. We overthrew the monarchy in Hawaii, which was, again, opportunistic and cynical. Before Woodrow Wilson announced that we were going to World War I to make the world safe for democracy, in fact, we intervened in Mexico to drive out a dictator that had overthrown a democratically elected president. We go up through World War II, the four freedoms. The first two were freedom of expression and freedom of religion. They didn't quite get that in Libya last night in terms of freedom of expression and freedom of religion. Obviously, after World War II, we are supporting European democracies with the Marshall Plan, with NATO, and that is the issue, as you're absolutely correct, throughout the Cold War and even into the post-Cold War period, supporting a freedom from Yugoslavia when they go for it, supporting the breakaway of East Timor. And again, perhaps cynically used in Iraq in 2003, when we went in not to establish democracy. That wasn't part of the issue going in. We were going in for weapons of mass destruction. There turned out not to be any. We had to come up with something. So so what? I mean, the planet is better off without Saddam Hussein. But the point is that this has been a feature. Now, it's also a source of trouble for us. And while there is this perception that we, backed the Arab Spring, I mean, there was a lot of hand-wringing, and America gets pushed. And this is where we get in trouble. America is blamed for what it does in the world. It's blamed for not doing some things. And it's blamed when it tries to do something if it doesn't work out. So we don't like situations like the uprisings in East Germany in 1953, or in Hungary in 1956, or in Czechoslovakia in 1968, because it kind of puts us on the spot. We don't like it. One of the reasons, by the way, a pragmatic reason the U.S. government likes democracies is they manage to change governments without creating a crisis that is liable to drag us in. We have difficulty dealing with that, and if they can have elections, then we don't have to do a damn thing. If it turns into a revolt, a separatist struggle, guns come out, then the United States is supposed to do something about it, and American presidents don't like that. Now, as for the role of democracy in counterterrorism strategy, U.S. counterterrorism strategy is officially set forth in two official documents. One is called the National Strategy for Combating Terrorism, February 2003. Remember that date. The second is called the National Strategy for Counterterrorism, June 2011. Add to this some speeches made by presidents and secretaries of state and others. These are, by the way, both public documents. These are not strategies in the sense of secret military plans. In fact, they have the quality of being kind of strategy brochures, if I can use that term. They imply a sense of order. They have a very professional communications quality. It's kind of a Madison Avenue quality about these things. I mean, the 4 Ds. Defeat Al-Qaeda, deny them of support and sanctuary, deprive them of the conditions that they can exploit, defend America. When you're into 4 Ds and things like that, that's Madison Avenue crap. But nonetheless, those are the documents. Now, they're comprehensive. They're comprehensive documents. I mean, they really deal with everything. But they're not precise. They say absolutely nothing about an allocation of resources. They say nothing about budgets. They say nothing about numbers of troops. They say nothing about sequential activity. It's more of a kind of a catalog of things. It assumes that they assume the struggle will continue, and that allocations and assignments will be made, will be decided by other people along the way. So it's not a strategy document in that sense. Basically, I mean, the U.S. government is a big, complicated government with a lot of moving parts. And by setting forth this document, it is a way of, in a sense, telling the individual agencies, well, you fit here on page 22, and you're here on page 16, and you draw up your detailed plans consistent with this overall guidance. The first document lasts 8 years, then there's the 2011 reset. In these documents, which is interesting, so we have these two documents, each document mentions democracy one time. One time. In the 2003 document, under the third D, diminish underlying conditions that terrorists seem to exploit. And the quote is, diminishing these conditions requires the United States to win the war of ideas to support democratic values. End quote. End of discussion of democracy. In the 2011 document, under the heading U.S. Core Values, things we must preserve in the course of this long fight, it says, quote, representative, responsive government is a core tenet of U.S. foreign policy and directly contributes to our counter-terrorist goals, unquote. That's it. This is not a big issue of pushing democracy as a component of counterterrorism. It is much more practical than that. Now, the fact is, people do make some connections between the two. One, we know that democracies, not just being targets, but democracies themselves have no immunity to terrorism. The UK had terrorists. France had terrorists. Italy had terrorists. Germany had terrorists. There is a concern that a terrorist threat itself poses indirectly a threat to democracy. That is, the reactions will erode democracy. There is the practical consideration that like-minded democracies in dealing with international terrorism cooperate more readily, so that's purely pragmatic. And as I say, in the long run, the preference for democracies is a practical issue, not only because we can get on with them more easily in a variety of ways, but they manage to get on with their own lives without creating the crises that create crises and get the lights on in the White House at 3 o'clock in the morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Just as always, lucid and incisive. I just want to mention, Brian, just exactly along the lines that you've said, when Condoleezza Rice was first appointed Secretary of State, she famously said that it was not the job of the 101st Airborne Division to escort kids to school in Bosnia, right? Bush administration, the first Bush administration, George W. Bush, the first 4 years, came into office in a way rejecting the sort of Clintonite notion of democratic enlargement and so on and so forth. 9/11 changed that very quickly and very dramatically, but when it did, again, as you rightly said, there was an organizing, legitimating principle there that the president and his team could gather the nation around, and that principle goes very, very deeply into the American soul, into the American foreign policy tradition, all the way to the founding fathers and so on and so forth. There's never been an American president who has disavowed the idea that the United States, as a city upon the hill, should be an example to the rest of the world. And of course, Obama coming into power on the promise of hope and change, since democracy promotion was such a notion so deeply associated with the Bush administration, the first instinct of the Obama administration was to distance himself from this idea of democracy promotion. In fact, there was a lot of criticism of the Obama administration that months and months and months into the administration, there have been no appointments in the National Security Council, and Foggy Bottom, and so on and so forth, to deal with this issue. That has been rectified to some degree, but you demonstrated, I think, very astutely how this issue fits in and out and weaves in and out of American strategic and tactical priorities. Last but not least, I'd like to invite Professor Charles Small to the podium. Charles is the director of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, ISGAP. He's also the Koret Scholar at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He was the founder and director of the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism. Again, his biography is long and international. I've known him for 20 years, since my bar mitzvah, pretty much. And he's a great guy and a great friend. Charles, please.
Thank you, Amichai. So first of all, it's an honor to be here in many respects, and obviously to honor Professor Sprinzak is also brings extra meaning because he was a leading scholar, and I read his books. I didn't have the privilege of studying with him, but his work was well known and still resonates. And I'm especially grateful to be here with Boaz and Amichai. And I'm not saying this to be polite. I think that what the ICT is doing is extraordinarily important, and it's been one of the few spaces, conferences that I've come to over the years where I really feel like you learn something and sort of all sorts of new horizons open. And it's very important. It's a great privilege to be speaking here with you. And Amichai is an old friend from our Oxford days 20 years ago. So I'm going to speak about issues of what's going on in the so-called Arab Spring. The title of my talk was "Denial Ain't Just a River in Egypt." It's from a Mark Knopfler song,
Very
Dire
cute.
Straits. And I guess it's appropriate. It was interesting how we commemorated 9/11 yesterday at the ICT in Israel. And when I went back to my hotel room last night, you can see how 9/11 was commemorated in Cairo and in Egypt, and in Libya, rather. Something that I think we need to take notice of. So I would say in the United States, coming from the academy in the United States and coming off the Yale experience, where I was the founder and director of the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism, it was the first and only, which ought to be a study in itself, the first research center at a North American university to ever focus on issues of anti-Semitism. And we opened it in 2006. And I would say, sort of caught up in the sort of Republican-Democratic Party divide, the issue of anti-Semitism is often perceived by some, I would say, sort of liberal or lazy liberal, postmodern intellectuals who I think view the Middle East through the lens of the 1980s, 1970s, and 1980s, and sort of the post-colonial, postmodern worldview, that any of us who focus on what is taking place in the Middle East, in Arab society, or in the Muslim world, as some people refer to this part of the world, the Muslim world. I always thought there was one world, but apparently there's a Muslim world. That when we focus on those who were once the colonized and the debased and on the receiving end of colonialism and sort of the legacy of postmodernism and Orientalism, the work of Edward Said that looked at colonialism and the condition of the Arab world, that those of us who then come along and say, well, that's very important. I think post-colonial studies and postmodernity has very important contributions to knowledge and to truth that shouldn't be dismissed. But when some of us now come along and are critical of those who were once colonized, given the sort of framework of the American Academy in particular, and certainly in parts of Europe, that those of us who are critical of the Arab, of anti-Semitism and sexism and homophobia and religious intolerance in the Islamic world, were right away categorized as being Islamophobic, being neoconservative, which I would actually, it's a whole long, this is another lecture, but I think it's a euphemism for being a Jew, but that's another story. That somehow we are categorized and dismissed. And as we are dismissed, the rise of radical political Islam, which is very difficult to put on the academic map to look at seriously as scholars, scientific understanding, interdisciplinary analysis of the issues, as difficult it is to be put on the map, the rise of radical political Islam marches forward. And it marches forward using anti-Semitism as a strategic weapon. In societies like Turkey, in Egypt, the second most consumed text after the Quran is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is the most pernicious form of European anti-Semitism. It's the document, the fake document, that led to the segregation, if you will, of Jewish people and the Jewish communities from European society. It subjugated them. It justified not only subjugation, but later justified the Shoah. That the Shoah did not begin with the bricks and mortars of the concentration camps or the railroad tracks leading to the camps. It began with ideas. And ideas then become policy, and policy then affects reality. And those same beliefs are now being widely disseminated throughout the Middle East, openly, honestly, and clearly, from Tehran and the organized state form of anti-Semitism, of genocidal anti-Semitism, of incitement to genocidal anti-Semitism, and despite the incitement to genocide anti-Semitism, which contravenes the Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide, and countries, nations of the world are morally and legally obligated to take a position on this, there has been basically international silence on this issue. The Muslim Brotherhood uses effectively anti-Semitism, genocidal anti-Semitism, as a weapon, as the fuel, if you will, to fill the vacuum in the societies that are experiencing all sorts of economic and political problems, are using the socialism of fools, anti-Semitism, as the fuel to fuel their rise to power, to taking over institutions regionally and internationally, and now increasingly taking over states themselves. So the perception in the United States, thanks to the popular media and the 24-hour news cycle of CNN and others, and this sort of division that exists between those who support Obama, especially after the Cairo speech. And I believe if you watch the Cairo speech today in the aftermath of the last year and a half, that we will see this speech one day, I would argue, worse than what the Chamberlain speech became. That this is a watershed moment that will affect us for generations, and affect us, those of us who care about democracy and human rights, the rights of women, of gendered identities, of religious minorities, and certainly those of us who care about the self-determination of Jews and the Jewish people in this part of the world and beyond. The use of anti-Semitism regionally is being pumped out internationally. And I would say that the discourse surrounding, and this is another whole issue, the discourse surrounding the place of Israel, the issue of Iran, the issue of democracy and the Arab Spring in the region, that this is all sort of interconnected to the future of the Jewish people in the region, and some of the discourse coming directly out of the White House on the cost of oil vis-a-vis the right of Jewish people in this part of the world to have not only self-determination, but the basic right of security. That somehow the discourse became connected for a while to the cost of a barrel of oil, which is amazing. The work of Matthias Kunzel, Jeffrey Herf, there's scholars who show the linkages between European anti-Semitism and how it was introduced and used in the region. And I think this is a very important area of study. If you look at the Hamas covenant, the charter, the raison d'etre, the constitution of this movement, this movement which roots are in the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that they use the protocols of the elders of Zion in their constitution, in their covenant with God and the land. And if it wasn't so serious, and the silence against this so deafening, it would almost be a bit of a comedy. If anybody watched them, like, it would be a Monty Python skit. That here you have a social movement dedicated to eradicating the presence of the other, be it Jews, Christians, communists, socialists, capitalists, people who advocate human rights. They take the themes literally. If they were a university, students taking a university course, they'd be kicked out for plagiarism. They've literally taken the protocols of the elders of Zion and infused it into their constitution, into their religious worldview. And this is an issue that permeates the Muslim Brotherhood, not only in this region, but in the other 75 to 80 countries around the world in which they operate, including the United States of America, which they operate with, I would argue, impunity, having more and more impact on the political discussion and political matters in the country. So, and I would say in terms of the work that the ICT is doing, and I hope in the sense that maybe the vacuum will be filled, is that those of us who do work on anti-Semitism, the study of anti-Semitism in Europe, which is mostly a European and North American issue of study, that we focus, the scholars of anti-Semitism look at more the issue in terms of history. And I think in a sense that I would argue that anti-Semitism is increasingly a strategic weapon, not only against the Jewish people and Israel, but against Western nations and notions of democracy. And there has to be a sort of a connection, I would argue, between those of the people who study terror, who understand the region, who speak Farsi and Arabic, who understand what's happening here, what the ideologies of these social movements are, and to sort of fuse the study of anti-Semitism to make it contemporary and to make it effective, and to affect not only the knowledge and the wisdom of students and faculty, but also to affect policy and do so urgently. If you look at basic notions of democracy, citizenship is the cornerstone of democracy. If you look at the work of Charles Taylor, Will Kimlicka, Michael Walzer, so the scholars who are who've done philosophical or social theoretical work, and this is my background. I'm not an expert in the Middle East or counter-terrorism or terror or geopolitical interests. I'm a student of this, but my work is more on issues of identity and notions of citizenship. That the cornerstone for democracy is the recognition of the other, is recognizing that everybody has a right to be equal under one legal system, regardless of their political views and orientation, their race, their ethnicity, their gender, their religion. And that this social movement of radical political Islam, of the Muslim Brotherhood to the Iranian revolutionary regime, is diametrically opposed to the basic notions of democracy and citizenship. Emmanuel Levinas, the great Jewish philosopher who was born in Lithuania, lived in France, escaped the Holocaust in Lithuania, and moved to France where his family was wiped out in Lithuania, and he dedicated his life, his work, of bringing notions of ethics, of Jewish ethics, and introducing it into the Occidental or European philosophical frameworks, and basically argued philosophically that we become human the moment that we see our face in the face of the other, and that this is the foundation of the ethics of treating the other. And I think just to maybe wake you up after so many couple hours of talking, I'd like to share a morning prayer. This is a prayer by the leader of the Islamic Brotherhood, Sheikh Qawadari, he was in exile until the so-called Arab Spring. Yes, that's right. Just a minute.
عليك بأعدائك أعداء الإسلام اللهم عليك باليهود المعتدين الغادرين اللهم عليك بهذه الطغمة الفاجرة الماكرة المستكبرة اللهم إنهم طغوا في البلاد فأكثروا فيها الفساد فصب عليهم يا ربنا صوت عذاب وكن لهم بالمرصاد. اللهم يا من أهلكت ثمود بالطاغية وأهلكت عادا بريح صرصر عاتية، اللهم يا من أهلكت ثمود بالطاغية وأهلكت عادا بريح صرصر عاتية وأخذت فرعون وجنوده أخذة رابية، اللهم خذ هذه الطغمة الباغية الطاغية، اللهم عليك بهذه الطغمة اليهودية الصهيونية الباغية، اللهم لا تبق لهم من باقية، اللهم احصهم عددا واقتلهم بددا ولا تبق منهم أحدا.
This is a slightly different perspective than Emmanuel Levinas, Taylor, and Walzer. I'm going to give you a quote from a great insight into the Muslim Brotherhood. The term Muslim Brotherhood is an umbrella term for a variety of movements. In the case of Egypt, a heterogeneous group, largely secular, which has eschewed violence and has decreed Al-Qaeda as a perversion of Islam. So secular and peaceful. Secular and peaceful. Who said this? The Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper. The White House Secretary Robert Gibbs in January and February of 2011, and I won't go into all the quotes, basically was saying that the Obama administration and the American government has had no contacts with the Muslim Brotherhood. So until April of 2011, they were denying all contacts. We also obviously know now it's come out into the open that there's all sorts of workshops and training programs to make them more engaged in the democratic, so-called democratic process, etc. It's interesting in terms of, we speak about red lines with Iran, it's also interesting that there seems to be no red lines with the notion of radical Islam and democracy in Egypt and in other spaces where the Muslim Brotherhood is taking over. It was interesting in the media, and I'll just go through this very quickly, that at the beginning of the process, the great commentators, scholars, intellectuals, with absolutely no surveys, no serious research in the region, the discourse was that if there's a free election, the Brotherhood would get about 10 to 20%. It eventually became 40%. Then the discourse was that if they're going to win, it's a possibility that they may win, but it's unlikely. But even if they win, that the Brotherhood will not run for president. The Brotherhood wins, they run for president. Then they said, if the Brotherhood wins, if they get the presidency, don't worry, they won't touch the army. And now we know they're dealing with the army and changing the generals. There's a whole discussion about how much of an effect it would have, but at the very least there's some people now that must be grateful to the new government who are in the military in the upper echelons, and God knows what's happening on the lower levels. Now the discourse, or the red line, is don't worry, now that they're facing great economic issues and troubles, they're going to have to be responsible. And they're going to have to feed the people, and they're going to have to be good international citizens. So as Boaz was saying, I think that we really need to not only study the Muslim Brotherhood and their worldview, their theology, their philosophy, their political agendas, but we have to begin to respect them. I don't agree with them. I think they're morally and ethically misguided. They're opposed to democracy, which I think intellectuals and scholars and policymakers ought to be very concerned about defending and protecting. But we need to respect them. So notions like Tom Friedman's notion, the Lexus and the olive branch, I would consider that to be extraordinarily condescending and racist. Who for a car or for a little bit of money is going to take to trade in their basic core beliefs and values? There's a few people that would do that, but people who believe in notions of, for example, the right of all citizens to be equal under one law, I wouldn't trade that for a nice car, personally, and I know many of my friends and colleagues would be like me, that they couldn't be bought on core values. And I think that these type of sort of respecting the other in the sense that studying them, understanding them, and perhaps once we do that, as intellectuals, as policymakers, that maybe we can come up with solutions that are effective. There's a great difference. Bobby Ghosh is one of the editors for Time magazine, very close to Fareed Zakaria and Friedman, a major international journalist, came to the Hoover Institute a couple of weeks ago, and he gave an informal talk over wine about how the Brotherhood is changing, how they're being responsible, and how the United States of America has a problem with Islam. That was the theme that of his talk. And I asked him one question: can you show one shred of evidence that the Muslim Brotherhood has changed? One. And there wasn't, he couldn't answer the question. And then he was sort of going on about how, the democracy is going to change them. And I was saying, as a scholar, as an intellectual, show us some evidence. And if there is evidence, we could even debate it. Maybe my standards will be different or my criteria will be different, but at least show me something. And there was nothing. So, the notion of what Boaz was saying, to have a free election doesn't mean to have a democratic election. And I think there's a profound difference. And I think one case that comes to mind is South Africa. As apartheid was ending, if you remember, Albie Sachs was placed in front of heading a committee to create a constitution. There was a constitution committee where all members of the society of the white former apartheid regime, members of the African National Congress and other oppositional groups got together to create a constitution. And in 1993, there was an interim constitution that was approved. And in that constitution, this was before the democratic elections, which officially ended apartheid, which was in 1994. But the transition focused on creating a constitution which guaranteed the rights and freedoms of all citizens, or what would become citizens in a democratic South Africa. So in 93, they created the institutions to create the foundation of a democracy. The Constitution was adopted by the first Parliament. It was one of the first acts they did in 1994. And then officially, through a whole sorts of processes, Mandela approved the Constitution finally in 1996, and then it was it replaced the interim Constitution in 97. And here we have a society like South Africa with problems and contradictions, and it's not a perfect place by any means, but the basic notions, the basic rule of law in which citizens are guaranteed the basic rights and notions of equality, that they stand before one legal system as equal citizens, at least it's enshrined and can form the foundation or the basis, hopefully, of an emerging social democracy. In the case of Egypt, and in other spaces in the region, we have this sort of notion of the Arab Spring, which the American Academy and the American journalists use, which is, as we've discussed, as other people discussed earlier, is problematic. And it's not based on serious academic research of surveys of what people want and what people need. And if you think about it, I'll just take one quick quote and think about it. This is the motto of the Muslim Brotherhood. Allah is our objective, the Prophet is our leader, the Quran is our law, jihad is our way, dying in the way of Allah is our highest hope. Now, I've read René Descartes and John Stuart Mill and Rousseau, and I can't find reference to this. And so the question is, as scholars and as policymakers, what are we going to do with this social movement, which is a threat to democratic principles? It's a threat, and I can show you other materials from the Muslim Brotherhood vis-a-vis its horrific, disgusting, genocidal anti-Semitism, its sexism, its anti-Christianity, its intolerance for Muslims who are moderate. So what do we do as scholars, as policymakers, with this threat to not only Israel, but I would say to Western democratic principles? And I'll end on one quick note. Those of us who study anti-Semitism, and this is I would ask you to think about it because it's not as obvious. It's going to sound very simple, but it's not. We argue that anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never, ever ends with Jews. So there's the assumption that those of us who are studying anti-Semitism or dealing with anti-Semitism we have this sort of parochial Jewish interest, that we just care about our own, and that's the end of the story. But if you look at the history of anti-Semitism, once this disease is unleashed on society in the name of putting the Jew in their place, that this disease permeates the society, attacks other marginal groups, and eventually it can deteriorate the core of the society. And anti-Semitism is being unleashed, and it's unchecked. And when Ahmadinejad comes to the United Nations in New York City and he speaks in the narrative of the protocols of the elders of Zion, or when Morsi comes to New York this time, who believes that the Jews blew up the World Trade Center and the conspiracies that emanate from the protocols, what are Western leaders going to do? Because they're also speaking to people in the West. This disease is also entering into the discourse of what's going on in the region and what's going on and how it will affect the only democracy in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles, for these powerful words. And really, both Brian and I are wonks, and we like figures and charts. And I haven't seen a lot of scholarship on the relationship between direct relationship between anti-Semitism and the spread of anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitic dimensions of the ideology that you've described, radicalization and terrorism. And I think this is an area where we need to do a lot more work. Well, we now have anywhere between 15 minutes and half an hour for conversation. The length of the period of conversation will depend on a competition of appetites. If you're physically hungry, then we're going to have 15 minutes. And if you're intellectually hungry, then we're going to have more than that. And you can choose. So why don't we? Let's begin here and work our way. Please introduce yourself and. Oh, delighted you're here.
The microphone, because you're also on air. So.
Yeah, no, I think so. Your point is well taken, and I think there needs to be a seriously informed, critical discourse about what is the Brotherhood, who do they represent, what are their ideas and their values, and what's incompatible with notions of democracy and citizenship. And those of us who care about human rights and democracy, which I think it transcends Democrat or Republican, or if we're left-wing or right-wing, whatever their political differences are, and there needs to be a serious, informed discussion about what is going on. And for some reason, which I don't know the answer to, I certainly have found in the academy and in the serious journalists in the United States and in Europe, there's this tremendous, I would even say, block, reluctance to deal with these issues, and it's dangerous.
But I wanted to ask, what would the American voters think of their president shaking hands with such a man? I'm interested. Do they care?
They ought to care.
Probably they don't know the information that you have. I mean, Americans have gone from reading newspapers to watching television to get their news to Facebook and Twitter, and so American reactions to things at that level tend to be devoid of intellectual content. But there is an issue, by the way, that actually more Americans know about, which is an upsetting issue, and that is his inaugural speech all of these various issues that you'd think he would have on his mind in terms of political issues, in terms of economic issues. His first order of business was release of Sheikh Abdurrahman, the conspirator in the blind sheikh, the conspirator in the 1993 bombing and subsequent terrorist plot, who was in prison. If Morsi comes and makes that demand on the White House, or starts talking about that on American television, I think that will have a tremendous impact on the American voters. But I haven't seen actually in CNN or Fox or any of the major media about these upcoming visits that in any sort of analysis of that. The talking heads haven't caught on to that yet. It should be on the day of the visit. I mean, it should be well in advance so that this type of thing can be circulated and somebody will run the story.
I want to add here with you about Morsi. Just a perspective, these kind of things are said by Saudi preachers all the time. And the U.S. has a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia. Protocols of Elders of Zion is available in every bookstore in Jordan. So he's not the only one. He's perhaps the newest one on the block, and the U.S. has a close relationship. But this is a very pervasive, including friends of the United States.
Good. Mark, can hear you.
Okay. Mark Abramowitz, I have a question for Boaz. I'm a little confused about something. You talked about the Brotherhood attempting to create a sort of a base to then go to the Gulf to create their caliphate. And as I understand, Al-Qaeda and so forth is Sunni. Aren't they going to run right into the Iranian Shias that might have a similar view?
You are referring to the rift between the Sunnis and the Shiite in the Muslim community, and no one should take a blind eye to this rift. But if there is one common denominator, is the hatred to, as we saw with Qaradawi, the hatred to Zionists, to Jews, to infidels, and to other Muslims which do not hold their version of Islam in any case. I think that we are not going to see a real alliance between Muslim Brotherhood, new entities, and Iran. But Iran is doing their best in order to become closer to those new entities, in order to influence them, in order to buy them. And I see it in a very bad eye, the fact that one of the first states that Morsi was traveling to was Iran. Delegations from Iran visited Egypt and vice versa. First time ever the Egyptians gave the permission to Iranian military ships to cross the Suez Canal. So still this rift will be there, but at least from the Iranian side, they will try to do whatever they can to bridge the gap between the two. Now, as for the ideological differences, of course there are many. I'm not a Muslim scholar, but the structure of this caliphate state in the ideology of the Shiite and the Sunnis is a different one. I don't want to live in either one of those structures in any case.
And gentlemen at the back, please introduce yourself. And if there are any, particularly, I want to encourage students, especially IDC students, if they have any questions. Good, we'll get to you. Anybody else, just give me a show of hand. Okay, yes, please.
Hello, my name is Barry Werner. With regard to this question of the complex relation of the United States with democracy, there are two, I think, very important historical examples that you missed. One, I think, a very important example is the United States' reaction to communism. Now, surely we considered communism to be anti-democratic, one reason we didn't like it. But we didn't fight communism democratically. We didn't allow, I'm an American citizen as well as an Israeli citizen, we in the U.S. didn't allow democracy to operate with regard to our reaction to communism. We didn't teach communism in our schools in the United States as a part of this, history of the world. We didn't allow communism to be preached or elected in other countries around the world. We tried to put a blanket over communism as we were fighting it. Once again, in the name of freedom and democracy, we didn't use freedom and democracy in that fight. And of course, our fight against communism ended with the Vietnam War, which is an experience that perhaps taught us that perhaps our reaction to communism was inappropriate, and that too, I think, is an important thing. The other historical event that relates to how the United States deals with democracy or anti-democratic regimes is the United States' failure to oppose Hitler in 1939. The United States waited until 1941, waited until Hitler declared war on the U.S., and I still do not know or wonder if the United States would have declared war on Germany even after Pearl Harbor had it not been the other way around. The reaction of the United States towards the anti-democratic and anti-Semitic Nazis in Europe was, I'm not sure what. I mean, I'm not old enough to know for sure. It's very strange. And of course, the refusal to even bomb the tracks leading to the concentration camps, death camps, or the death camps themselves is something that really makes you wonder how complex, how contradictory the United States' reaction to democracy really is, even when we're trying to fight for democracy.
It's a point well made. Thank you. Tal? Yeah. Tal, we haven't finished with the... Oh, sorry, Charles, you want to respond to that?
So a very quick point. As a Canadian Israeli, I think it's a point that's well made, and it's interesting how Canada entered the war 3.5 years before, if I'm not mistaken, before the United States in World War II, and a few days ago took a very strong and principled stand vis-a-vis Iran, which is interesting. I wish the Canadians had an air force comparable to the United States, but at least morally they made a point. And I think there is some sort of historical correlation. In the United States, there were good relations among German and European industrialists, and I think they were kicking the can down the road, hoping that this Nazi movement, they were anti-communist, they were making some trouble, but they wanted to keep business going as usual. And I suspect, in a very real sense, that that's sort of the agenda today. That there's some serious problems in the Middle East. It's causing some instability, but if we can just sort of delay the problems a little bit longer, and business is as usual, everything's okay. They can continue investing in our universities and in our institutions, and we need the investment, so everything works well. But at some point, we can't kick the can down the road. At some point, how many societies, how many institutions, how many countries are going to turn into this very real anti-democratic movement, and when are we going to take the stand? And I would argue there are similarities to the point you made to what's happening today.
Tal, then we're going to take questions from two students, 1, 2, and then you two gentlemen. I'm going to get back to you. There's always this lack of balance between female speakers and male speakers. So if you're a female speaker, you're going to get bumped up the queue if you identify yourself. Tal, please.
Yes, Tal Brody. Yesterday was a good lecture from England, that fellow from London, about demotivating radicals in England. I'd like to hear if there's anything ongoing programs about what's happening with moderate Muslims in the States to get them involved and get them into the mosque, get them into the radio, television, in order to speak for moderate Muslims and not radical Muslims. Wafa Sultan, the fellow that made the Jihad, the movie. Are there any ongoing programs? Can you relate to that?
The government has formulated a strategy to address radicalization as opposed to de-radicalization. I'm not talking about programs that a number of countries have to try to rehabilitate former Al-Qaeda or other jihadists. But there is a U.S. actually strategy that has been formulated to deal with radicalization and recruitment to terrorism in the U.S. The strategy is based upon really empowering, and I think this is appropriate, empowering local communities to do this. One of the things that you learn when you look at radicalization in the United States is that the term Muslim American or American Muslims is far too broad and imprecise of a term. There are Muslim communities and that are very, very complicated, different diasporas, different Sunni or Shia. All of this is you have to really look at this at the local community level. There is one issue, by the way, however, that's good news in the United States. There are a lot of concerns, but the good news is in the period between 9/11 and the end of 2011, there were a total of 192 persons arrested for either providing material support to a jihadist organization or attempting to go abroad to join a jihadist front, like these five students from Northern Virginia, or, more seriously, plotting to carry out terrorist attacks in the United States. 192 out of, over a 10-year period, out of a population of approximately several million. No, we don't have any precise count, but out of approximately several million Muslims, works out to be 6 out of 100,000. I use that term because criminologists love to use 100,000 as markers for homicides and other crimes and things of this sort. And that's over a 10-year period. So it turns out to be 0.6 per year. It's a tiny, tiny number. To give a number by way of comparison, the prison population of the United States is 750 out of 100,000. The point is that these efforts thus far by Al-Qaeda to motivate an army of jihadist warriors to engage in acts of do-it-yourself terrorism has really not gained any traction in the Muslim communities. Now, we don't, when I say radicalization and recruitment, how many have participated in these online things and have become radicalized is not something that we know. We just don't have that number. We only know the number that have crossed the line to do something. And so they may have there may be thousands who have been radicalized, but over a 10-year period, 192 crossed the line. That is, that overall suggests that there is a certain strength in American society in its ability to assimilate and absorb. Now, I say there are trouble areas. There are some communities, some Salafist communities that we worry about and watch. There is community outreach programs that are being done to, for example, halt the recruitment of Somali Americans to go back to fight in Somalia, which have had a great deal of success. The other thing that is a positive development is that in these plots that have been uncovered, between a third and a half, and the reason for the uncertainty here is in some cases there are multiple sources for information, but between a third and a half were brought to the authorities' attention from the community itself. That is, somebody in the community saying, these guys are up to something, watch out. So all of that is good news. Now, there are intensive intelligence activities going on. They do focus on the on certain portions of the community that has provoked complaints from the community. But the fact is, when we had intelligence activities to crack the Ku Klux Klan in the 1960s, we did not focus on African Americans or the B'nai B'rith. We looked at good old white boys from Alabama and Mississippi. And when we went after, with intelligence operations, the fanatical right-wing Cuban extremists who were carrying out a series of over 100 bombings in the Miami area, we looked at the Cuban community. And so my answer when I've heard these complaints from the Muslim community is, if we were dealing with Viking terrorists, the investigations would have a different demographic. But since the concern right now is jihadists, welcome to America, this is what you get. But it's worked out so far successfully.
Let's take a question from you, and you, and you. I want to get everybody, as much as we can. Everybody will get a chance. I promised you and you. But let's gather the questions together, and we'll allow our panelists to respond collectively. So.
My name is Joel Marks. I'll be a master's student in counterterrorism. I wanted to ask Dr. Ganor, in your fourth recommendation, you talk about promoting the values of democracy and not just the apparatus, which I think is necessary and important. Not just these hollow elections, but I think about freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. At best and realistically, I was wondering if anyone could paint a picture of what we could hope that would look like in a Muslim country where you can't depict the Prophet Muhammad, where obviously they're not open to other religions. When you see what happened in Benghazi and Cairo last night, it's just in such a closed culture. What could we hope that a democracy would look like in these countries? Thank you.
My name is Michael. Our questions are quite similar. I wanted to ask Dr. Charles if you refer to the spray the mosque as a terrorist action, and if so, how can you fight it while being disguised and behind the freedom of religion?
Sorry.
Hi, my name's Marilyn Stern. My question's for Dr. Small and perhaps Mr. Jenkins. You talk about in America the respect that's the de-radicalization, the respect between the different religious groups and towards Islam. Since Israel is such a flashpoint, what are the conversations that come up when these interfaith initiatives take place?
Okay. ambassador.
Just to start from here. Professor Said Khattab, Global Terrorism Research Center, Australia, Melbourne. I'm originally from Egypt. I did some work published and a lot of works on counter-terrorism, de-radicalization, and terrorism-related issues. Thanks for everyone for the panels and for the presenters. In fact, we have heard a lot of talk about the view here, but we haven't heard of the others, how they think. Now, let's start from what happened tonight. The film which predicted the Prophet Muhammad or insulted the other, is this anti-Arabism as equal to anti-Semitism? Also, have we heard or we thought anti-Semitism is anti-Arabism? Have we ever thought that Arabs are a Semitic race too? About democracy, I have published also a book about democracy in Islam. The book, I think, here in Israel too. The book is translated into many languages. I was, in fact, using this as to contain terrorism. So it is an idea to de-radicalize. It is difficult to de-Islamize the Middle East. To come to anyone and tell him, leave your religion. It is difficult. It is exactly like you. So what we can do is to facilitate to them the way of democracy and freedom, respect of others, and then human rights, women's rights, power sharing and caring, and all of these topics and more are there. I think the book is here. The other thing, I do agree with Professor Ganor when he said democracy is not only election. I said that, thanks for him too. I said that earlier, and I have introduced a new definition of democracy. Is not the rule of people for the people, by the people. And the new definition, this facilitates for us to use Islam as Islam as a democratic, has democracy there, and promote human rights and women's rights. So democracy never meant, shouldn't be reduced to mean only election. What after election of human rights, women's rights, and so on. Also,
thank you very much. Can you, if you have additional points, can you choose one additional point? Because I want to give the last word to one of our students. Last question, and we'll have the panel respond. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for being.
What happened in Egypt? Sorry about that. What happened in Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood? I think the Muslim Brotherhood, when they were in opposition, is one thing. When they come to governance, is another. As any party in the world. Number two, for Professor Professor Charles, and the one who said about to understand Islamic fundamentalism, and this is, I have published this about Islamic fundamentalism, and this also the theological and the political basis of Al-Qaeda's political tactics.
Okay,
so the road to the thinking of Al-Qaeda is here. I'm not promoting the book or anything like that. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And then last question, back. I'm like a Polish mother. I don't want you to go hungry. It's very important for me that you eat. A Jewish Polish mother, I should add.
Okay, I'm Pascal. I just finished my first year, and I have another year at the IDC. And just to remind everybody about the panel's topic, it was promoting democracy to curb terrorism, wishful thinking or practical solution. And what I was kind of missing here was like really the answer to this question. We heard a lot. The first speaker came out and he talked about that we have 7 hypotheses. The U.S. should focus on dealing with terrorists, and regaining the homogeny, and that supposedly spreads the democracy. And then we heard that, you know, maybe through Boaz Ganor's speech, we don't really have a choice. It has to come from the Muslim world. They have to deal with the problem, but then that again goes away from what are we doing. So maybe it's going more towards wishful thinking. And then the last speaker talked about when we talk about anti-Semitism, these thoughts that are being spread, they lead to action over time. And so once these thoughts are out, this is the question. Once these thoughts are out, it seems to be impossible to eradicate them, as we see in the documents of the Elders of Zion. So what are the actions, and should we take any actions in order to prevent this? And if so, what are the actions that we should do to prevent this from happening?
Okay, thank you. Maybe we'll start with Boaz, and we'll each panelist could...
Okay, I will try to be brief. I will refer to 2 questions, the first one and the last one, and I will refer to them together. If you ask me what is needed to do, I would say we should imitate what the Muslim Brotherhood have been done for the last few decades. Exactly the same thing, without the harsh and violent education. So what they did, they actually bought the hearts and minds of the masses for many years. They didn't call for violence, but they intrigued the ideas of global caliphate states, the demand from each one of those devoted Muslims that believes in their views to sacrifice himself if needed for that purpose, and so on and so forth. They did that in an indirect way. They opened a mosque. In the mosque, they have the madrasa, a school, and they conveyed the message. The people that were coming to and creating this community in this specific mosque could have going to another mosque, which is much more pragmatic, but they chose that because they got welfare services, they got education services, they got religious services free of charge, and actually, practically, they bought the hearts and minds of people for generations. It's a very long process. We, the international community, some Muslim regimes and others turned a blind eye to that because it was not violent. It was maybe preaching to something down the road. Some people understood that as the need to use violence, but they didn't use violence, and they was not very open in calling for violence for that matter. What is needed is to do exactly the same thing, to invest the needed resources in order to buy the hearts and minds of the masses into what I would call real Islam, for that matter, and not the misinterpretation of that concept. And nobody, I think, here would say anything in reference to Islam, which is different from any other religion for that matter. Unfortunately, anyone can take, and I would say that in that way, anyone can take any religion and misuse that. Because when you induce the divine command to impose your religious ideas and you are ready to use violence for that, then religion becomes dangerous. It could be Christianity, it could be Judaism, it could be Islam. Unfortunately, we have right now a problem in Islam that can and should be solved first and foremost by the Muslims themselves.
I just want to say something to Tal Brody. There are a number of Muslims who appear in the West, in the United States. We might call them moderate Muslims, or they have a profile. You may have heard of several of them. We have to be careful about holding some of them up on a pedestal to the local Muslim community, because a lot of them have actually converted to Christianity. Okay, I'm speaking, for instance, of one of the leaders of Hamas, his son, who's actually. So we have to be very careful about some of these rather famous people. I'm not going to mention them all, but some of them actually converted to Christianity and no longer are representative of the Muslim community at all. So to bring them can actually backfire sometimes. Just want to issue a note of caution there.
So to respond to some of the points quickly, so the point of anti-Semitism, for example, I think anti-Semitism, and I'll be very quick, is a term that's used specifically for the Jewish condition coming out of Europe. I would argue there's no such thing as the Semitic people, race, ethnicity. These are socially constructed notions of identity that have a whole history in and of themselves. And I would argue that anti-Semitism as a phenomenon comes out, it was a term coined by Wilhelm Marr in 1879. It depicts the European Jewish condition. Anti-Semitism, I would argue, and it's a whole story, a whole long explanation, is different than other forms of discrimination, including anti-Arab, anti-Islamic sentiment in different societies. Anti-Semitism, unlike other forms of, anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, coming out of the European condition is inherently genocidal. When there was the religious form of the dominant way of seeing reality, i.e. Christianity in Europe, the Jews were the wrong religion, and people believed that if they would accept the Christian Messiah, not only would the Jew be saved, but the world would be saved. When Europe started to perceive identity through the lens of the nation, of ethnicity, of race, of biologically determined notions of identity, the Jew had to be removed not only to save the race, but also to save the nation. And I think that anti-Semitism today, as its focus, is sort of like an onion. There's all these layers of old anti-Semitisms and current, but it's focused on Israel, the demonization of Israel. There's actually people who believe that if Israeli policies would change from the settlement policies, that not only would there be peace between Israelis and Palestinians, but the whole question that we've been discussing in the Middle East will somehow be magically removed. And there's people like Kaudari who believe that if the Jews and the Zionists are removed, that the world will be saved. So this is specific. It's a long story. Very quickly, in terms of the question on issues of interculturalism and the question of what to do with the mosque and democracy. So very quickly, in social democratic societies, in countries, for example, like Canada, where it was the first country to create this notion of multiculturalism, there's a private sphere where people have the capacity to lead their lives and practice their cultures with a certain level of autonomy. And in social democracies, we have to recognize the other and integrate them socially, economically, and culturally. So there's the private sphere, their temple, their home. They can basically do what they wish. And there's a public sphere where there's less freedom and they have to contribute and integrate into the society. So we adopt some of their practices. They enrich our society, but they also have to assume the practices of the social democracy. And there's certain practices that people come to and beliefs that are illegal in democracies. Honor killings, polygamy. There's certain laws in Canada, as an example, that are just certain practices are not permitted. And this is the delicate balance of creating a democracy which is inclusive but upholds the rule of law and equality.
Thank you, Charles. As you can see, sorry, Brian.
I'll just say one comment going forward. I mean, in response to your remarks about U.S. reluctance to become involved in World War II. Coexisting with the notion that the United States is a special place with a special mission in the world of democracy is a strong sense of isolationism. That is, it is not the business of the United States to become engaged in the contests and turbulence of the world. And there is no question that that isolationist streak was extremely powerful during the 1930s and was something that the president, who had different views, had to deal with. That isolationist streak in American history has again surged. We saw it in the recent primary campaigns, and it's represented by some of the candidates. And the environment now in the United States is that it has gone through a costly war in Iraq, not just having lost 4,000, 5,000 young men and women, but tens of thousands who are permanently disabled as a consequence of the war. The war has cost us various estimates running between 1 trillion and 3 trillion. We still have tens of thousands of troops engaged in Afghanistan, where the fatalities have now reached 1,500, and again, thousands who are permanently disabled. The country is in financial difficulty, and therefore the likely attitude of the United States for the foreseeable future is that it's not going to have a lot of stomach either for military activities abroad or for its mission of promoting democracy. Now, circumstances can drag us in that direction just as 9/11 did. But right now, the reality is that the United States is in a different place from where it was in the days following 9/11, probably closer to what it was in the days immediately preceding 9/11, in which then President Bush was highly critical of the previous president for involving us in all of these things in the Balkans and Haiti and elsewhere in the world, and said enough. And so we are back there again, and so we careen back and forth between these.
I want to thank the members of the panel for their insight. I want to thank you for your engagement and your ideas. And in particular, I want to thank Geneviève, pardon, for helping us organize this workshop. Bon appétit, everybody. Thank you very much.